Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm delighted to talk again to Dr. Abdullah Sueidi. You're most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam. And Dr. Abdullah has been on Blogging Theology a couple of times before, some very interesting videos. Just do a search for those. For those who don't remember, Dr. Abdullah is a Swedish convert to Islam, and he holds a PhD in Islamic theology and is a specialist in topics related to atheism. And he has taught in Al Masjid Al Nawabi and the Islamic University in Medina, where he is at the moment, and has been active in teaching Islam in Sweden for well over 15 years. And Dr. Abdullah has kindly agreed to talk to us today about Islam in Sweden itself. So perhaps, Doctor, can you tell us something about Sweden as a country, just to start with?
Bismillah. First of all, I thank you, Paul, that I have another chance to come here to your channel, and it's a big pleasure for me. I think that most people that will listen to the talk heard about Sweden before. Many people, or many Muslims, used to have a quite good picture of Sweden. I remember when I used to travel to the Muslim countries the first time 20 years ago. When I said I was from Sweden, many people said, "Oh, Sweden is a good country," and so on. Yeah. But in the recent years, many people they heard bad things about Sweden, things that happened in Sweden, people that burnt the Quran in public, and other tougher policies against Muslims and so on. So when I speak to Muslims in different countries now, people usually have a worse or not so good picture of Sweden. And Sweden is also used many times as an example in political debates and even religious debates. You can see many secularists, when they speak about Sweden, they say it's like a model country with high moral standards, and how a country can be prosperous secular country without religious morals and so on. So many times they use Sweden as an example. And also you can see conservatives in different countries, when they speak about Sweden, they take Sweden as a terrifying example. What happens to a country when immigrants come to the country and they show like chaotic news reports of high crime and riots in the suburbs and so on. Even President Donald Trump used Sweden as an example for his presidential campaign.
Oh, my goodness me. I didn't know he was picking on Sweden. Really, that's a bit much.
Yeah. And you can see people use Sweden in different examples. So I think most people, they heard about Sweden, but I will try as well as I can to give a nuanced picture about Sweden and the relation between Islam and Sweden. And I think it's an important subject, not only about Sweden as a country and the relation between Islam and Sweden, but also in a broader picture, the relation between Islam and the West that we can see as an example here in Sweden. And also we can have a chance to speak about the future of Islam in Sweden and in Europe generally, inshallah ta'ala.
So just to clarify, if I may, Dr. Abdullah, so Sweden, am I right, is the largest of the Scandinavian countries, because you also have Norway and you also have Denmark, these three countries in the same part of kind of Northern Europe, and they're quite similar in some ways geographically, linguistically even, and they're often grouped together, aren't they, as Scandinavian countries?
Yes. You say Scandinavian countries, it's Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. And the Nordic countries, it's Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Iceland. So Finland has a totally different language, but Norwegian and Swedish and Danish are closely related languages. So it's easy for a Swede to understand Norwegian and Danish.
And not getting Iceland, which is geographically like a long way away, but still.
Yeah, it's a long away, but they have some Vikings were living in Iceland too, so we have some.
I'm glad you mentioned Vikings, the V word, because everyone associates Vikings as well with, and not today, of course, the distant past. But I mean, when did Swedes first come into contact with Islam, or was it just recently, or is there a history behind this?
First of all, like I said, Sweden is the biggest country amongst Nordic countries, and first time people moved to Sweden, they mentioned it was like 12,000 BC. I don't really know, but this is what they said. But they don't have any written sources about Swedes from that time. And the first time that Swedes are really mentioned in written sources is during the Viking Age. And the Viking Age is between 8th century and 11th century. And Vikings, they were polytheists, but they moved around a lot. So they
certainly did. They came to England quite a bit as well.
Yeah, they came for trade and for raids. So they raided Russia, England, Ireland, France, Andalus, and Spain, North Africa. Wow. They went to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So they went to 3 continents and raided these countries and traded over there. So it's quite interesting because Sweden at that time only had about 100,000 inhabitants. And the largest city in Sweden at the time is called Birka. Only had about 700 to 1,000 inhabitants. That's the biggest city in Sweden.
It's a tiny hamlet or village.
Yeah. At the same time, Baghdad had about 1 million inhabitants. That's just only Baghdad. And Cordoba had about 500,000 inhabitants and so on. And Vikings, they never wrote books, but they have inscriptions, what they call runestones. So you can know something about their history from the runestones. And at the same time, Al-Hakam al-Thani, Al-Hakam the second, in the Caliph in Andalus, he had a library with about 500,000 books. This is at the same time as the Vikings. They only had some inscriptions, and it was like the culture in the Muslim world was really prosperous at that time. And Vikings were going around raiding people.
A real sense of the superior cultural civilization of the Muslim world, which of course was in Europe at that time as well. The Iberian Peninsula, what we now call Spain and Portugal, was a part of the Muslim Empire, and it was incredibly advanced in terms of culture and economics and every, even cleanliness and so on, than the rest of Europe, Christian Europe, which was very much in the Dark Ages, as it's called.
Yeah. And most of Europe was Christian during the Middle Ages, but Sweden became Christian in the beginning of the 11th century. So Sweden became Christian quite late. The first Swedish king that was baptized was Olof Konung, the year 1008. And then it took about 100 years after that until Sweden became a Christian country. So Sweden was first a Catholic country. And then during the Reformation, it became a Protestant country. Sweden was one of the first countries.
Was it specifically a Lutheran? Martin Luther is a Lutheran country. So in all the battles between the literal physical battles, Sweden was Lutheran. Other countries were Calvinist or Anabaptist or whatever. But Sweden was a follower of Martin Luther, clearly.
Yeah, and the Reformation started in Sweden 1527. And Martin Luther, he died 1546. So Sweden was adopted Christianity and Lutheranism really early during the lifetime of Martin Luther. And the king that established Sweden as a Protestant country, a Lutheran country, his name is Gustav Vasa, and he is considered to be the father of the modern Sweden. And Sweden after that became a great empire in Northern Europe. And they took parts of Finland, Norway, northern parts of Germany, Estonia, and they fought the Poles and the Russians like a form of sectarian religious warfare. Yeah, and this it's very important when we speak later about the relation between Islam and Sweden. Because Sweden was founded.
So to say, today people think Christians get on well together. They're interdenominational, ecumenical movement, but in fact, historically, Christians have been at war with each other over religious differences. So you just mentioned your Lutheran country attacking Russia, which of course was Russian Orthodox, a bit like Catholicism, and there were got the Roman Catholicism, of course, which was banned, I think, in Sweden. So the religious wars were really strife, schism, antagonism were really there for much of Christian history. It's only very recently, with the rise of secularism and liberal democracy, that I think the temperature has decreased quite a bit.
Yeah, during the 17th century, it was forbidden, strictly forbidden, to have any other faith than Lutheran Protestantism in Sweden. Mm-hmm. So if you came to Sweden as a Jew or a Muslim or a Catholic or anything else, you had to convert. It was forbidden for you to enter Sweden if you were not a Lutheran Christian. So Swedes were quite harsh on religion during that time. And they even used to have something that is called house interrogations in Sweden. So the local priest used to go to the houses of people, each family, and ask them about their faith, if they have memorized the faith, the Lutheran faith, in a correct way. So they had interrogations about the faith. So Sweden as a country was quite a homogeneous country, where most people were from the same ethnic group. We have some other ethnic groups, but most of them from the same ethnic groups. All of them were Lutheran Christians, and they were quite harsh on their faith.
Everyone else had, sorry.
Sweden only had laws about total religious freedom in 1952. So even before that, Catholics could have some problems in Sweden and so on. It started to get lighter and lighter during the 19th century, but at the same time, Sweden was quite harsh when it came to Protestantism.
Wow.
What happened during the 19th century in Sweden? Sweden was quite a poor country. 800,000 Swedes moved to USA during just 25 years, from 1865 to 1890. It was only 4 million inhabitants in Sweden, so 800,000 people moving to USA at the same time because of poverty and so on. It showed that Sweden was a poor country. And many people started to move into cities and were during the industrialization and so on. And they had poor conditions, like this the same way as in UK and so on. So socialism started to spread in Sweden a lot in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And socialism at that time was very, very secular and even anti-religious in many ways. They even had some they were inspired by Satanism at that time.
Wow.
Even in other countries, So the Social Democratic Party in Sweden used to have a newsletter called Lucifer, and they had and they had the 10 Commandments, and they said the first commandment
is another name for the devil, isn't it? I mean, this is like his personal name. You know, you couldn't. No one else is called Lucifer, just the devil. Amazing.
The first commandment of the 10 commandments in their newspaper was, you should not have any other gods beside me, the light bringer. So and this is the political party that have been ruling Sweden for most of the 20th century, and this is one of the reasons why Sweden is such a secular country. So Sweden went from a really religious Protestant country to a secularized country, and one of the main reasons for that is that the Social Democratic Party ruled in Sweden from the 30s and most of the 20th century, and just until they lost the elections a couple of weeks ago or a month ago so in Sweden, they ruled also most of the 21st century in Sweden. And in the beginning, they were very anti-religious and secular. And then they started to light up more and more and so on during the time. But this is one of the main reasons why Sweden became a secular country. Another thing that is quite interesting in Sweden is that Swedes, they were very affected of social Darwinism and Darwinism. So they had what is called the State Institute of Racial Biology in Sweden. And they conducted racial studies of tens of thousands of people in Sweden between 1922 to 1958. And even leading Nazi biologists, they praised Sweden. They say Sweden, really, the research in racial biology is one of the best research and so on. So Sweden was a leading country when it came to eugenics and racial biology at that time. And they even continued with these studies after World War II. Germany stopped all of these studies, but Sweden continued during the 50s with these studies. And the Social Democratic Party, even though they were socialists, they had, if you see what their old politicians used to say about these things, they used to have really racist statements about other ethnic groups and so on. And they even used to have what is called compulsory sterilization in Sweden. So they could, of tens of thousands of people in Sweden, and people that they thought were like mentally retarded, or they did not have, they were from other ethnic groups and so on in Sweden. So Sweden was a homogeneous country when it came to race, because they race or ethnic group, and at the same time, first the Protestant faith and then secularization. So there were not many foreigners living in Sweden. There were some Jews and some other ethnic groups, but not so many. After World War II, Sweden not participated in World War II. So the industry in Sweden was intact after the war. So they needed a lot of people coming to the Swedish industries to work. So in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of foreigners started to move to Sweden to work there. And they used to have what is called assimilation politics. So if you came to Sweden at that time, you had to assimilate to the society, because they still had the kind of thoughts that they had before. If you come to Sweden, you have to be a Swede when it comes to values and other things too. But in 1975 in Sweden, they changed their politics to what is called multicultural politics in Sweden. So they let people establish their own religious faiths, and they could establish their own culture, and they even could have money from the government and so on. And Sweden started to accept refugees too, especially in the 90s. So now in Sweden, about 2 million people of 10 million people are born outside of Sweden, and about 30% have some connection to other countries. Either they're both their parents or one parent, or they're born outside of Sweden. And in some cities in Sweden, it's about 50% of the population. So Sweden has changed a lot during these years, from being a homogeneous country to being a multicultural, multi-religious country. So if we speak about the relation between Islam and Sweden during these periods of time, we can see first the Vikings and Islam. Like I mentioned, Vikings, they went around, they raided, they traded in different countries. So they came to Muslim countries. They have found 168,000 silver coins from the Islamic world in Sweden, in Gotland, in Ireland. Dated back to the 9th to the 12th century. They even found...
These are Muslim coins, so presumably in Arabic, are they?
Yeah.
Right, in Sweden. Right, okay.
Yeah, so most of the coins, they even found what's called spilling hoard. It's 14,000 coins in a specific place, and almost all of the coins were from the Muslim world. So they had probably... they had trade with Muslims, or they reached the Muslim lands in those days. But like I said, the Vikings did not write books. So the sources that we have about the relations between Vikings and the Islamic world were from the Islamic world. They used to call them Rus in their books. It's a Persian historian living in the Abbasid Caliphate. His name is Ibn Khardadhbah. He lived in the 9th century, and he mentioned that they reached the capital of the Caliphate, Baghdad, during those times. So some Vikings came to Baghdad. And other sources mention that Vikings tried to raid Andalus, and they reached Sevilla, but they were captured, and then they converted to Islam. So some Vikings converted to Islam, and they lived in Andalus. And other sources mention that Vikings raided Azerbaijan, 943, and they killed thousands of people, and they even took many Muslims as slaves. And they thought that maybe they took them to Sweden. So maybe the first time that Muslims reached Sweden was during the Viking Age, but there are no real evidences of that. But it's a possibility. But some Vikings maybe became Muslims.
Gosh, it's a new idea to me. Muslim Vikings. I've got to get my head around this. I wonder what they look like.
Said that they used to make cheese to Muslims living in the Andalus.
Really? I wasn't expecting you to say that. Now you mention it. Okay, Viking Muslim cheesemakers. Okay,
yeah.
More interesting every second this picture of these guys are. Okay, cool.
One of the most interesting books that have been written about that is a Muslim traveler called Ahmed ibn Fadlan. He went from the Abbasid Caliphate to Volga, and he met the Vikings over there. Yeah. So he wrote a book about what he saw from the Vikings.
I actually have a copy. It's actually translated into English. I actually did a BT thing on that, discussing Viking funerals. The only first-hand eyewitness account of a Viking funeral ever, and all that led up to that is actually quite horrific, I suppose, because they also burnt live human beings on the funeral part of the person who had died. So but it's an extraordinary story.
When you study Norse religion, like the polytheist religion of the Vikings, one of the main sources that you go back to is the book of Ahmed ibn Fadlan, because he described the Vikings, and he said about them that they were the most dirty of Allah's creation. So he did not think too good about them. And he described their pagan rituals and so on. So there were some interactions between Muslims and Vikings during that age, but we don't know so much about that. Like I mentioned, Sweden became a Catholic country, and then and when they were a Catholic country, they did not travel so much and so on. It's not so much known about that period of time too, because Swedes stayed in Sweden most of the time. They did not participate in the crusades and so on. But when Sweden became a Protestant country, they were surrounded with Orthodox and Catholic countries. And these countries fought the Muslim countries. So they had alliances with the Muslim countries, because it's like my enemy's enemy is my friend. So they started to establish diplomatic alliances with some Muslim countries, like the Khanate of Kazan and the Khanate of Crimea and the Ottoman Empire. And you can see, like, Protestants during that time, they had so many disputes with Catholics. During that time, there was a motto or a saying in Netherlands. They said, "Liever Turks dan Paps," rather a Turk than a Catholic. So they had better contact with Muslims than they had with.
A lot of the Protestant polemic against Catholics is quite Islamic, actually. The emphasis on there being one God, not worshipping saints and idols and other mediators like Mary and the saints and so on, and a direct relationship with God rather than through priesthood and a sacerdotal understanding. So it's quite an Islamicized version of Christianity, although obviously they did believe Jesus was God and they believed in the Trinity and so on. But so you can see there might be.
Even Martin Luther himself, he wrote some bad things about Islam and about Muslims and so on. But they saw it like a strategic alliances with the Muslim world against the Catholics, because there were so many religious wars inside of Europe at that time. But it's quite interesting with the context that they had. And one of the most interesting things that happened in Sweden during the 18th century was that the King Charles XII in Sweden, he went to war against Russia, and he lost the Battle of Poltava 1709, and then he fled to the Ottoman Empire, and he stayed there for 6 years in the Ottoman Empire. Yeah.
Did he convert? Did he convert to Islam?
No, he did not convert. He stayed and he ruled Sweden from the Ottoman Empire for 6 years.
Wow. Yeah. That's extraordinary. I mean, so the idea of Sweden going to war with Russia just seems crazy. It's like today, Sweden going to war with You just don't do it. Russia's his big bear. How could he possibly go to war with it? But anyway, he tried and lost, as you say.
But it's not, subhanAllah, it's not so far away. 1709, it's 300 years ago. It's not that far away. And the Swedish king living in the Ottoman Empire and ruling Sweden from over there. That's quite interesting. And when he lived there for 6 years, he borrowed a lot of money, 2.5 million riksdaler, like the Swedish money, and 1.5 million from private lenders. So in the end, the Ottomans, they had enough of him, so they threw him out. In the end, he had 2,000 people with him. So when he went back to Sweden, he took people from the Ottoman Empire that he borrowed money from. He took them back to Sweden, some Muslims and some Jews. And they stayed in Sweden for a couple of years. And he had to write a royal decree allowing them to enter Sweden as Muslims and Jews, because that was forbidden in Sweden. Yeah.
An amazing story. Gosh. I don't know if you finished or not, but I mean, the next question really is, what's the situation like for Islam and Muslims in Sweden today, given we're now in a very secular world, not just in Sweden, but throughout the West, of course, a very different world indeed.
I can mention that the first converts to Islam from Sweden, there was some converts to Islam during the 17th and the 18th century. A Swedish commandant called Johan Julhammar, he converted to Islam during the 17th century, and he went to Indonesia and then to Ottoman Empire. Another guy called Henrik Wilhelmsson also converted to Islam and went to the Ottoman Empire. And one guy called Johan Öhman, he converted to Islam and was an advisor to the Sultan in Libya. And that was during the 19th century. And he took the name Abdullah Sueidi. And he was an advisor for the Sultan for 20 years. That's quite interesting. But Sweden did not have any Muslim citizens during the 19th century. The first Muslim that came to Sweden was a Tatar that came in the late last years of the 19th century, and in census 1930 in Sweden, it's mentioned that it was 15 Muslims in all of Sweden. God. That's 90 years ago, and now it's more than 1 million. So it's a quite big change in Sweden. Yeah,
gosh, that's huge.
There was some people that converted to Islam also, and they became Sufis. They were interested in the whole Oriental things, so they traveled to the Muslim world and became Sufis during that time. And then some Turks moved to Sweden. The first Islamic organization that started in Sweden was in 1949, and they started their first prayer place where they prayed in 1959. And they even went to the prime minister in Sweden during that time, and they wanted to open a real mosque, and he forbade them. He said it's not allowed for Muslims to open up he did not allow Muslims to build a whole mosque in Sweden. That's during the 50s in Sweden, because they had the whole...
What was do you happen to know the reason that he gave why? Because it's very hard for us to... I mean, Sweden now is known for its being very liberal and very open, apparently. But you're saying the Prime Minister actually forbade the opening of any mosques in Sweden. And this is actually within living memory for some people.
Yeah. Tage Erlander, it's not so long ago, too. They say, one historian that I saw, that I read from, he said that maybe he thought that Sweden is they're going to build like a big Turkish mosque or something like that. So he said that this will change. I don't know what. But this is how Sweden was like in the beginning, even after World War II.
Yeah.
And then more and more people came to Sweden, more and more Muslims. And in the 70s, subhanAllah, it was only 1970, it was about 10,000 Muslims in Sweden. Like I said, now it's 1 million. So it's a big change. And you can see also that like the leader of the Islamic organization in the 70s was a woman without a headscarf and a short skirt in Sweden. So they were living in accordance to the assimilation politics.
Thoroughly assimilated. assimilated, completely assimilated by the sounds of things.
Yeah. It's really interesting. But when Sweden changed the politics in 1975 for multiculturalism, they started to take more and more refugees to Sweden, and they started to establish mosques and Islamic organizations in Sweden. So Sweden really changed their whole politics 180 degrees. And they established good relations with the Islamic organizations in Sweden, and they even worked with their political parties, and they allowed them to start Islamic schools and build mosques and so on. But this was only during a short period of time. And I will come to that later, because now
it's very different today, isn't it? There's a tiny window when the kind of the ideal, when there was this freedom of worship and association in Sweden. And then, so what went wrong? What was the change in the political, cultural atmosphere, such that things have turned very differently these days?
During the 90s, there were many different wars in different Muslim countries. It was the Yugoslavian war in Bosnia, in Iraq, the Gulf War, and the civil war in Somalia, and so on. So in a short period of time, hundreds of thousands of Muslims came to Sweden. So like I mentioned, in the 1970s was 10,000 Muslims, and 2000, about 400,000 Muslims. So just in a short period of time, hundreds of thousands of Muslims came to Sweden, and most of them at that time were refugees. They came as refugees to Sweden, and that's not the same as people coming there to work. They're educated and so on. Many people did just fled from their countries.
Right.
Yeah, and many people are poor and so on. So even at that time, Sweden. When people came, they used to say that they should live in accordance to their ethnic, cultural way of life. So Arabs came and lived together, and Turks lived together, Somalis lived together, and so on. Not totally, but usually you could find different areas in different suburbs. Most of the people are from that country, and most of the people are from that country, and so on. And many of these people are poor. And there is a high rate of criminality in these areas, and so on. So the racist parties, or they started some racist parties in Sweden, or anti-immigration parties, that started to focus on these issues: immigration, assimilation, and so on in Sweden. And also one other thing that happened in the 90s, that some people affiliated to terrorist organizations settled in Sweden. There were very few of them, like tens of them only, but they started to look at Muslims. Some authorities started to look at Muslims as a security threat, and that escalated, of course, after 9/11. So, and then also after that, during the civil war in Syria and so on. Hundreds of Swedish youth, they went to Syria to fight and so on. And this also affected how people looked at, or how many Swedes look at Islam. So if we look at the situation now in Sweden, we can see like there was a golden age between Muslim organization and the Swedish state in the late 80s and the 90s, and also in the beginning of the 21st century. Even some Muslims, they started to reach higher in levels in different political parties. One Muslim became was a minister, secretary of state, and was a minister in the government, and so on. And then everything's changed like 180 degrees. So they started in media to focus on the Muslim politicians. He got fired, the minister, just after 1 year, and all Muslims, active Muslims that working in the political parties, or the famous for that they are like practicing Muslims, all of them got fired from the political parties in just a couple of years at the same time. There were new parties in Sweden that was anti-immigration. There were usually small parties in the beginning, but now in the last election in Sweden, Swedish Democrats, they have neo-Nazi roots. Like the founders of the party were neo-Nazis, and then they became more and more democratic in their way. They are the second biggest party in Sweden now. So, wow. And the coalition that rules Sweden now are together with this party. So things changed. Like in the beginning, they only had 0.5% and so on. And then more and more and more, they got more and more votes at the same time. But this party managed to put pressure on the rest of the parties in Sweden. They used to focus on immigration, used to focus on Islam, Muslims. There are so many Muslims coming to Sweden and so on and so on. So even the other political parties started to put more and more pressure on the Islamic organizations. So we had tens of Islamic schools in Sweden that were closed in just 2 or 3 years now from the former government that was ruled by the Social Democratic Party. So they're putting more and more pressure on lowering the number of immigrants and putting pressure on Islamic organizations that they have to comply to different democratic values that they mention and so on. And they are more and more speaking about why can the gays get married inside of homosexuals getting married inside of the mosques and so on. They try to put more and more pressure with the secular values, liberal values on the Islamic organizations. And like I mentioned, only about 2 months ago from now, there was elections in Sweden, and the coalition that rule Sweden now, from liberals and conservatives, are together with this party that has neo-Nazi roots in Sweden. They are focusing a lot on Islam in media. There's an Islamic organization that made a study of the number of articles in Swedish media that mentioned Islam and Muslims, and they saw it was more than 60,000 articles in 1 year about Islam and Muslims, and most of them are focusing on Islam in a very negative way. So people are really getting brainwashed when it comes to how to look at Islam and Muslims and so on. So in accordance to some surveys, it's mentioned in 2011 that 54% of the Swedes said that they have a negative view on Islam, and only 10% said that they have a positive view of Islam. And this is only escalating. Now the whole political climate at the same time makes it more, it's okay to have negative views on Islam, and even discrimination in working place. According to a study, 80% less chance to get a job in Sweden if you're a Muslim. So they have institutional racism in many instances, and also physical abuses of Muslims, especially Muslim women. It's not the whole society, of course. Many Swedes are open to Muslims, but if you look at this survey and other surveys, it shows that most people have negative views against Muslims, and this really affects how the whole situation with Muslims in Sweden.
And this is sort of sadly parallel in other European countries, in France, obviously, Italy, Britain to some extent, where the media,
Germany, Netherlands.
Yeah, the Netherlands, and indeed, the list is quite long. Where the media tend to be problematized and criminalize Muslims, and just so the recent events of the World Cup in Qatar, the way the British media, at least, is discusses Qatar as if it's this object of derision and condemning it, and so in a way you would never speak like that of the United States if it was host the World Cup, or other European countries who've got a very, very long list of problematic policies and invading other countries and so on. But their right to host the World Cup would never be questioned. So it's very, as I said in a recent video, the asymmetry.
Double standards.
Sorry?
And I think it's important to understand the whole history. If we understand the history of these countries, that Islam, they have a relation with Islam since a long way back, but at the same time, Muslims living inside of these countries and so on, this is something quite new. Like Muslims really living in accordance to their faith in Sweden. It's like 30, 40 years old in Sweden only. And Sweden was a homogeneous country. They had a state institution for racial biology in Sweden. So they have the whole history, and now many Muslims are coming in just a couple of decades, and things have changed. Really, if you go to the suburbs in Sweden, you don't see, you can hardly see ethnic Swedes. You can see, like, if you go out on Jummah, Friday prayer, you can see people going around with thobe, Muslim clothes all over the place and so on. So things have really changed in Sweden. Just wondering,
I having spoken to people who know much more about these things than I do, that the sense is that Muslims generally in Britain, these are obviously first, second, even third generation Muslims, are broadly speaking have retained their faith. They're still conservative on those values, which very much are at odds with the rising militant secular liberalist values on say LGBT issues and so on. And that surprised me. I thought Muslims might have buckled here, but they haven't, at least not yet, alhamdulillah. But what about what is the situation of Muslims in Sweden today? Are they resisting, or are they buckling under this top-down pressure to become more, inverted commas, Swedish? I say inverted commas because this is, what is Swedish values anyway, given the history you mentioned of Lutheranism and militant hostility towards Catholics, and then you have kind of the rise of secularism, and then you have the rise of atheism, and it's not really clear what Swedish values are historically, but I mean, are Muslims in Sweden today retaining their faith, or are they going under? How would you see it?
Of course, it's a big difference now. In the 70s, it was only 10,000 Muslims, and now it's 1 million Muslims. It's 10% of the population.
Wow.
They say a researcher called Tobias Hübinette, he said that it's 20% Muslims amongst the youths in Sweden. So 10% of the whole population, but amongst the youths, it's 20%.
That's
and
incredible.
I think this is one of the highest percentages in the whole of Europe. So now if you go to different places, you live in some suburbs, you live in some areas and so on, most of your neighbors will be Muslims. You will have a musalla, a prayer place that you can go to. They used to have Islamic schools before that they can go to and so on. But you can even see that the Islamic organizations, many of the Islamic organizations, they don't really tackle the problems of the Muslim youth today. So most of the mosques in Sweden are mosques of the imams of the mosques are imams that came from other countries, did not grow up in Sweden. Many of them do not speak Swedish so well and so on. So they give khutbah in their languages usually and so on. So there's a big it's very hard for the imams of many mosques to reach out to youth who grow up in Sweden. But at the same time, during the late 90s and during the 21st century, many converts and people that grew up in Sweden, they went to study. They went to Yemen, they went to Saudi Arabia, to the Islamic University like I did and so on. And then they came back to make dawah in Sweden.
Right.
And this dawah of people that grow up in Sweden, they speak the language, they know how people think, the second generation of Muslims, the third generation of Muslims and so on, they have really managed to reach out to many Muslims in Sweden. Wow. So we have like a website in Sweden, it's called Islam.nu. It has hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. And that's in a country with only 10 million people. 10 million people speak Swedish, so hundreds of thousands of people going in, visitors to the website each year. That's a lot, and reach out to people on social media and so on. Especially people, students that study in the Islamic University in Medina, they really reach out if they go to mosques in Sweden, it's always packed. People are always coming to the lectures and so on. So there's a lot of people coming back to religion. Alhamdulillah, a lot of people converting to Islam too. So there are good things, but at the same time, you can see the pressure are really affecting many Muslim youths too, especially those who grew up in schools where most of the people are ethnic Swedes and so on. They have been very secularized in many ways. So we can see that we have different paths at the same time. One path that they're trying to pressure, and now they will pressure more and more and more. And at the same time, there are more people coming to the mosques than ever in Sweden. More people coming to lectures, more people listening to lectures online and so on. There's never been more people doing that in Sweden than any time before. I think
London, by the way. I mean, whenever I go to, I went Juma this lunchtime in central London. It's just the problem is for the Muslims in mosques like this, and some of these mosques are quite large. Is fitting everyone in because they are so popular, and then amongst the youth. This is not like this is young people. That's the challenge: how to get everyone in. But I wanted to ask a very specific question about Salafi dawah in Sweden, and this, of course, can attract the anxieties of people in Sweden who don't understand Salafism, of course, because of the infinitesimally small number who use that label to justify jihadi extremism, terrorism. I mean, but in the main, obviously, the vast majority of Salafis are Orthodox Sunni Muslims who are not in any way, on the contrary, they're very anti-terrorism. But how successful is Salafi dawah, particularly in Sweden, in your view?
I can say like this: in Sweden, when I grew up, I never heard the word Salafi. The word Salafi was never mentioned in media, and so I didn't read it. Maybe it was mentioned, but you never read about it.
Yeah.
Just in the last maybe 7 or 8 years, it has been mentioned in thousands of articles in Sweden.
Right.
So the word Salafi in Sweden really means, or how it's portrayed in media, Salafi is an extremist that is either he is a ISIS member or very, very close to being ISIS. So if you say to someone in Sweden, okay, this person is a Salafi and so on, he can get fired from work. He can get a lot of problems and so on. So it's like a word used in Sweden for the worst kind of extremism in Sweden. And it's very hard for secular Swedes to explain to secular Swedes about what Salafism really is, or how it can be understood.
The reason for this, because it's completely... there's a complete disinformation to suggest that about Salafi Muslims. I don't know the reason. I can only attribute it to simple media brainwashing. Most people think that because it is so disconnected to reality, real Salafis who are anything but that characterization. The only cause I can think of, as I say, is state or government or media brainwashing, pumping out fake news, the cliche, fake news all the time, and then we believe it because they don't have alternative sources of information, usually, I guess. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah. It's if they mention Salafism in Sweden, it's like, oh, we have Nazism and we have Salafism. So it's like they are making it. This is almost the same thing in Swedish media and so on. So it's a very sensitive, very, very sensitive word to use in Sweden. Or a term in many ways. It's not like when I see it in other countries, like in UK and so on, people are using the word in a different context. And that's also something that you can see, that the word Salafism, people are using it in different contexts in different countries. So it could be understood from people or from the public or from the media or from the government in different countries in many different ways. So
my question, Abdullah, was thank you for that. But the question was, given that we understand the real realities of Salafism, so moving away from the negative disinformation that's pumped around Sweden, it seems, how successful is real Salafi dawah in Sweden? So in the positive sense that we understand it to be, is it making inroads into dawah amongst the youth in a positive way?
What they mention, like researchers and so on, they say today there are tens of thousands of Salafis in Sweden. I don't know. There are no census. There are no like statistics on that. But you can see some researchers. This is what they mention, and they used to mention before that there were only tens of Salafis in Sweden, and now they say then they said thousands of and thousands, tens of thousands. I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe not. So yeah, this is what has been mentioned.
Fair enough.
In that way, yeah.
I think perhaps moving to our final question, really, what do you think about the future for Islam and Muslims in Europe generally and in Sweden specifically? So focusing now on the future, I mean, we're seeing trajectories, aren't we, here, where you've been speaking about this. You know, we see a curve that's moving in a certain direction. Do you see that largely negative curve or paradoxical curve? Because there's a negative curve in the one sense, but on the other hand, at the grassroots, religion is growing, green shoots are shooting up despite very adverse circumstances, and that's certainly true in the UK. It seems like it's true in Sweden. But what do you think about the future for Islam and in Muslims in Europe in general as well?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and in the end of the day, the only one who knows the future is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God. But so like if I would say to someone living in the 70s, and there were 10,000 Muslims in Sweden, after 50 years in Sweden, there will be 1 million Muslims in Sweden, and you will have websites with hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, and mosques filled with people who come in there and pray. No one would believe you. And now this is the reality. If you would say to a Swede that we will have the second largest party in Sweden will be a party with neo-Nazi roots, they would not believe you 50 years ago. But now this is the reality in Sweden. So things are changing very, very quickly in Europe and in Sweden. Yes. And there's something that is really that they can't really do anything about. And this is the demographical change that is happening in Europe and in Sweden specifically. Yeah. We have 90,000 people, about 90,000 people in Sweden dying each year. So in 11 years, that means 1 million people have died, 10% of the population. 140,000 people are born each year. So in 11 years, that's 1.5 million. So you can see just in 10 years from now, 11 years from now, 1 million that are living today will be dead. And we will have 1.5 million more people living. And you can see that most of people that dies are ethnical Swedes, old people and so on. And we can see that Muslims have much higher birth rates than non-Muslims in Sweden. So Pew Research made an estimation 2016. They mentioned that the highest numbers of Muslims in Western Europe was in France, 8.8%, and followed by Sweden, 8.1%, and then UK, 6.3%. And they made 3 different estimations of the number of Muslims in European countries 2050. So they say if it was a low immigration rate, France would have 12.7% Muslims, Sweden 11.1%, and UK 9.7%. Medium migration, 20% in Sweden. Sweden would be the highest country, and France 17.4% and UK 16.7%. And if it would be high migration, 30% of the population in Sweden will be Muslims, and 18% in France and 70% in UK. So according to this research, Sweden would be the top country if we would have medium migration or high migration with number of Muslims. And now, of course, the new government and also the old government, they are lowering the migration rates in Sweden. But at the same time, there's a demographical change happening in Sweden with ethnical Swedes getting older and older and dying. and more, and like I said, 20% of the youths are Muslim, so they will give birth to children, and so on and so on. And at the same time, Europe are going through big demographical problems. So we have in Sweden, between 2019 to 2028, the number of people over 80 years will increase by 50% in Sweden, from 500,000 to 750,000. And a person that is older than 80 years old, they say that it costs 10 times more to society than a person that is working. So they will need people in Sweden that will work. They can't stop migration. They can't stop immigration. They need people coming to Sweden. This year was the lowest birth rate in 20 years in Sweden. Each woman is giving birth to 1.6 child. And that's too low. They have a big demographical problem in Europe that they have to solve in some way.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a European-wide. In Italy, apparently, the replacement rate has really plummeted, which means Italians are, well, on the way to becoming extinct, basically, unless they have more babies. And the Catholic Church is the only institution I'm aware of in Europe that actually talking about this, or has even the Pope has mentioned this is a real crisis facing Europe, that it is basically becoming extinct unless it actually. And as you say, the economics of it are so real and so powerful that you have to suck in immigration to sustain the society you have, with an ever-increasing elderly population that need healthcare and pensions and so on. So it's a real and this whole mixture, of course, is something that the right fixates on and talks about, and they come to power because they say, well, look at the immigrants, but maybe there are other solutions to these issues rather than just attacking Muslims.
Yeah, and I think this is why they focus now on assimilation one more time. They had the multiculturalism, and now it's finished. Now it's going to be assimilation. Yeah. And they are going to focus on Muslim adopting their values, because they can't get rid of Muslims. Muslims will stay there, and Muslims will be in the country. So, what are Swedish values today? Some of them, they say it's Christian values, but we had, like in 1972 in Sweden, 95% of the population in Sweden was still members of the Church of Sweden. Now it's down to 53%, and it's getting lower and lower each year.
By a couple of percent every year, isn't it? It's going down.
1 to 2% each year. Yeah. So is Sweden a Christian country? No. You can't say it's a Christian country. It has a Christian history, but it's a Christian country? No. Most of the prime ministers or ministers, they like in USA, you can see Donald Trump holding the Bible and speaking about God and so on. This is almost impossible in Sweden, that the prime minister will speak about God and so on. It's very, very seldom in Sweden. Can you say that Swedes today or Westerners today have the old rational Enlightenment values that they used to have? No. You can see, like, postmodernism is in the universities today. This is, especially when it comes to social sciences, this is how they think in postmodern terms, and it's totally different from the old values that they used to have during the Enlightenment and after that. So everything becomes relativistic and constantly changing and so on. People lose their identity, even they lose their gender identity. So people are really confused. Like in Europe today, they don't really know what their own Western values are. They speak about Western values usually in polemics when they speak against Muslims. So we have our Western values and so on. But when you try to break it down, you speak to them, you can see that they have different values. You have conservatives, you have leftists, you have people that have different values and look at these issues in totally different ways. So speaking about the Western world, that they have like a firm set of values that they all stick to, it's not true, because it's constantly changing.
Yeah, it strikes me then, in the way you're speaking then, that the largest faith group that will emerge in Europe, in Sweden especially, if not now, but certainly in the near future, would be a group that holds fast, it seems to me, to the faith of Abraham, the faith of Moses, the faith of Jesus, the faith of Muhammad, peace be upon them all, in a way that is becoming the only group left doing this. If the churches are in decline and if they have assimilated to secular liberal values, which most of these churches are, promoting certain issues, won't go into those. But it seems the only faith group left bearing witness, being a beacon, being for Abrahamic monotheism, one way of putting it, will be the Muslims. And maybe this is the destiny of Muslims in Europe, to keep the torch, alight for Abrahamic monotheism in Europe, when the rest of Europe, indigenous Europe, shall we say, is abandoning it. But they're not abandoning it to something robust and solid and that can give meaning and purpose. They have, as you say, embraced postmodernism, relativism, where there's no meaning. There's just chaos. But maybe that is Islam's unique vocation in Europe, to be a beacon of hope and identity and faith in the one God, almost by accident. Obviously, in the divine scheme of things, it may not be an accident, but in terms of the horizontal perspective, immigration, wasn't really long-term thinking about this. So maybe that is the destiny ultimately of Muslims in Europe, to be this beacon of faith, where everyone else is abandoning it in effect.
Yeah, I think so, because postmodernism comes with relativism, and that life doesn't really have any true meaning, and they don't even have any truth anymore. It's all relativistic, it's your truth and so on. But at the same time, we as human beings are always seeking for meaning in life, seeking for the truth and so on. And Islam will come with absolute values and with the truth to people. And I think this will attract many people, especially in this age now. Yes. And also people see they have been living their individualistic, Sweden is one of the most individualistic countries in the world. And 35% of the Swedes are living by themselves in their houses and so on. And people need belonging, and they can see Muslims, they have brotherhood, they have sisterhood, they are coming together in mosques and so on. And people long for this. People long for this. I really think that Islam, especially now, will become more and more attractive in the Western world. Especially now, we can see some leading public intellectuals and figures in personalities in social media and so on, getting attracted to Islam, some converting and so on. I think this will really be an eye-opener for many Westerners to Islam, inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. Well, that's why ultimately I know it's sooner to be optimistic anyway, but that's why I'm actually, if I look at it through that lens, or what one can be very optimistic about the future of Islam and Muslims in Europe. It doesn't mean it'll be easy for Muslims in Europe, but in terms of the bearing witness to these solid, enduring, absolute values, which are very deep values of faith. We're not dealing with a political ideology or something or a fashion. We're dealing with something that's very deeply rooted in our species, the belief in one God, part of the fitra, as Muslims call it. And if Muslims are bearing witness to that quite powerfully in their very lives, in their families, and so on, this could be a great healing, dare I say it, a great mercy to Europe, that they should find this pathway to salvation if they want to take it, of course. So maybe there are good grounds for optimism, despite the clouds and the storm clouds. Maybe there's some optimism as well.
Yeah, I think so. And especially now with subhanAllah, with social media, you can reach people. I speak to people that converts, they're living in villages in Sweden, that they convert and they're living over there. This would be almost impossible. Yeah. Like I spoke about the first Muslims coming to Sweden 90 years ago. We had 15 Muslims in the whole of Sweden. How could you reach to people living in villages, living in other places and so on? Now you can reach to people all over the place. And also some Europeans, they think that, it's impossible for us to become Muslims. This is not part of our identity. But if we look at the history of Sweden, they were polytheists, and then they became Catholics, and then Protestants, and then Enlightenment secularism, and then postmodernism, and so on. They are constantly changing. So why not?
You're all over the place. So, yeah. But that's why I say, the Swedish values, you look at the history, you think, hang on, there are no Swedish values. There's a whole history of succession of different ideologies and religions and so on. And for Muslims, of course, they view Islam as nothing new. It's just the restatement, the reassertion of an old-time religion, the faith, as I say, of Abraham and Moses and so on. So, maybe there's something to that. Okay.
I hope so. You have to keep on working, inshallah ta'ala. Spread the message.
Absolutely. And I know you're doing amazing work behind the scenes to that end. So, well, thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah Sueidi from Medina in Saudi Arabia. And that's yet another untold story. Swedish people in Saudi Arabia, the community there. But we were a bit too late to go into that now. But thank you very much indeed for sharing your fascinating insight.
Thank you very much. Very nice to speak to you.
It's such an important thing what you're doing, because it's really important we understand what's going on in Europe, because of the geopolitical hegemony the West has at the moment. We need to understand the forces, the conflicts and the religious issues and the demographic issues as well in Europe, because unfortunately we have an outsized influence on everyone else in the world, I mean. So it's important to understand this. So thank you very much indeed to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Nice to speak to you. Barakallahu feek.
Until next time.